shaping innovation and entrepreneurial potential, because I do think we could also frame it differently, which would be, well, how do we not waste human potential in these great organizations that have a lot of skills, people, and assets? And with us we have Efosa, Ojomo, we have Steve Blank, we have Bill Fischer and Ashok Krishnan. I'll introduce them afterwards. What we want to do is create a little bit of a cafe house atmosphere. We'll sit here, do a little presentation, but then have a conversation, and we will introduce a little bit of interactivity so you get to activate your brains as well. But I'm going to hand over to Efosa, who is a research fellow at the Clayton Christensen Institute for Disruptive Innovation and president and co-founder of Poverty Stops Here. And you have a new book coming out next year. So I'll hand over the floor to you.
All right, thank you, Alex, and thank you to the Drucker Forum. It's an honor to be here. I'm going to first confess that I talk too much. I don't have a lot of time, and I've got a Swiss guy who's my chairman, so I have to make sure I say everything I want to say. First things first, I got a message from Clay. He's sorry he can't be here, but he's hoping to join us next year. And so if you were thinking about missing the Drucker Forum next year, Richard has promised us it's going to be epic, so don't miss it. I've worked with Clay over the last couple years, and he has changed the way I think, changed the way I think about innovation, changed the way I think about organizations and economies. And so a lot of what I'm going to share today are going to be some of the ideas that we've worked on over the past couple years. Now, one of the first things he has taught me is how to think about innovation in the context of an economy. And so if you think about any economy, egalitarian or with high income inequality, you typically would have the really wealthy people would be a very small portion of the economy, and then as you get people less wealthy, they begin to be more, and perhaps folks at the lower income would be a lot more. And the way we think about innovation is really about accessibility, right? How do you create access for as many people in an economy as possible? That is at the core of creating prosperity, and that's what we're here to talk about today. Because the folks in the center, the rich, are always going to have access to money and influence to purchase existing innovations. But if we can create innovations and democratize them so that as many people in the economy have them, that really is at the core of economic prosperity. And so perhaps one of the best examples of this is what this guy did in 1998. His name is Mo Ibrahim. And in 1998, if you looked at the telecommunications market, mobile telco in sub-Saharan Africa, it was about 0.6% penetration, right? About 800 million people, less than 5 million mobile phones. Today, there are about 600 to 700 million phones. And when he went and talked to some of his colleagues, he was in the UK at the time, and said, I want to create a mobile telco market. They said he was crazy, they said it would never work, and they said there's absolutely no potential on the continent for cell phones. Cell phones are rich men's toys. But he was able to do it, and as a result of him doing it, he has created tens of billions of dollars worth of value, and he was able to sell his company in about 7 years for $3.4 billion. Okay, now he's a billionaire, and many of us are not. But that is really at the core of the kind of work we do. It almost always looks unlikely, it almost always looks impossible, but there's some fundamentals that he believed, and he was able to create this market. And so, if we think about it in the advent of computing, the same thing has happened. 60 years ago, we had mainframe computers. Then in the 80s, we had personal computers that disrupted mainframe computers, and now we've got mobile phones. All of us have mobile phones, smartphones, and many people in countries across the world, rich or poor, now have mobile phones and smartphones. Now, this is what creating economic prosperity looks like. It is the democratization of innovation for as many people in society as possible. And so one of the things Clay does really well is give us language, a language that we can use to understand the kinds of innovations that our organizations are engaging in. And the way we think about it at the Christensen Institute is primarily there are three types of innovations. One is a type of disruptive innovation we call market creating innovations. These are the kinds of innovations that target what we call non-consumers, people who historically could not afford products and services that existed on the market. It could be in any industry. They create jobs and enable development. The second kind are sustaining innovations. These are innovations that typically improve performance. And so if you go from an 8 gigabyte memory on your phone to 64 gigabyte, you've improved your performance. But that typically does not create a lot of development, doesn't create a ton new jobs. And the third type are efficiency innovations. These types of innovations are important. All the innovations here are important. This is where companies do more with less, and so you outsource and things like that. None of these innovations is bad. The struggle is the capital that we have today chases aggressively, typically efficiency and sustaining innovations. And it's very difficult for us to pull that capital back to investing in market-creating innovations, which is partly why you see a rise in corporate profits because we're releasing cash flows, but you also see a rise in inequality and dissatisfaction and a rise in populism. Now, why is this the case? Well, these innovations have different kinds of characteristics. If you look at a market-creating innovation, when you go to your organization and say, this is what I want to do, people may say, oh, you're crazy, that's never going to work, there's no market for it. The internal processes in your organizations haven't quite caught up to creating new markets. Sustaining innovations, you know, when you tell someone, oh, we've done a market study, we know people want to take more video with their phones, for instance, we need to invest in more memory, that's something that you can take to your manager and they would probably be like, yep, let's invest some dollars. The payback is also shorter and you can sell it for more margin. Efficiency innovations are probably the easiest to invest in because you say, hey, we're doing the same thing we've been doing. We can do it for a lot less money. And you know, you would be unwise if you don't invest in efficiency innovations. Again, all these are critical for the vibrancy of organizations and the vibrancy of economies. The struggle is, it's very hard to convince people that they should invest a ton of money in a new market that doesn't yet exist. There's a reason Apple is the most valuable company in the world, because successively, it invests in creating new markets. It's not an easy thing to do, but you can see that that model is quite simple if you're able to figure out the formula to create new markets. Now, the path to prosperity, because that is what this is all about. At the core of prosperity, in Irene's presentation, she talked about how when you look at the global development landscape, how you develop economies, right? It's all about let's invest in education first, let's invest in all these things that seem to make a lot of sense, but it turns out it is really the innovators that invest in what we call non-consumers, people who have not had access in the past. They create new markets, and as they create those markets create profits, jobs, and change the societal culture, and those are now invested in structures like education, infrastructure, and so on. And so with that, I know that was kind of rapid fire machine gun type talk, but with that, I'd love for us to kind of transition into a buzz group. And so if you would answer this question, which one of these three types of innovations does your organization practice?
Okay, so the way this works is each one of the panelists is going to put up a question. You discuss for 1 minute with your seat neighbor, in this case, which one of the three types of innovations does your organization practice? With your seat neighbor, let's go. 1 minute, I'll clap after 60 seconds.
And I'll put the... And I guess you can go
back
forward
to the question. To the question.
Oh, the question.
To the question.
Okay. Yeah, go back to the question. Oh, sorry. To the question. I put the three types.
Wait. There we go. Oh, go to the question. Yeah, great. Yeah. Okay. Okay, let's continue together. Shh. Okay, excellent. Do you all agree when I clap, we continue together, hands up if that's fine? We'll be very Swiss on timekeeping. Excellent, great. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Steve Blank. Steve Blank is a retired Silicon Valley serial entrepreneur, participated in building 8 companies. He started the lean startup movement, which many of you might know, and today he teaches at Stanford, Berkeley, and Columbia, and many other places to teach the secrets of how do you do innovation as a startup, but more importantly today also in institutions that are more established. Steve.
Thanks, Alex. You could tell I'm from Silicon Valley because out of the 400 people in this room, I'm the only one wearing a brown jacket. And the people from Silicon Valley know I'm in Europe because I am wearing a jacket. So Richard, wait till you see what I wear tonight. So one of the interesting things is, as Alex mentioned, and he was being shy, it's Alex's work, my work, and Eric Ries's work that the 3 components came together for something called the lean startup, which was our observation that in the 20th century, at least for startups, investors essentially said, without using these words, that startups were smaller versions of large companies and had us do everything large companies did, when in hindsight, in fact, the large companies at their core execute known business models, but startups search for them. And we just simply didn't have any tools for searching as a formalized methodology, and lean was an attempt to do so. It's now kind of been adopted in Silicon Valley. Every startup at least says they do lean. The US government adopted my class at Stanford as the basis of commercializing all science in the United States. In the last couple of years, lean, with the cover May 2013 article in the Harvard Business Review, which said lean startup changes everything, gave corporations a kind of almost an excuse to think about adapting and adopting these startup techniques to deal with continuous disruption that every large corporation was facing. And herein lies a conundrum, is that 2 of the largest companies that were adopters of lean were GE and Procter & Gamble. Only some of you are laughing, and no one at GE and Procter & Gamble are laughing this month, because for those of you who know, activist investors, the same one, actually made a run, and as of this morning, they recounted the votes at P&G and discovered that he also has taken over Procter & Gamble. And so one doesn't have to see too far in the future to realize that lean and innovation is probably going to be out the window with probably a much heavier focus on execution. And therein lies the question for corporate executives in large companies. I started thinking about what just happened here and why. And what just happened and why is that there's a different set of rules, a couple of different factors about guidance in the 21st century that were different than the 20th. There are 4 forces that are happening to corporate executives, particularly CEOs, 2 which existed before and 2 which just they never had to deal with before. The first one is, what are your board's expectations for not only profit and revenue, but what was your board's expectations for innovation? Are they, do you have a target number? Do you have target profits? Is it return on net assets? Is it market share? And the 20th century was pretty clear what your board was asking for, and smart CEOs were always in contact with the board, making sure the board's expectations and theirs were aligned. And then if you were a great CEO, you obviously had your antenna out about competitive pressures. Who were your peer competitors? What were they offering? Your salespeople were always complaining. You needed cheaper, better, more. What was your supply chain doing? And then you started to pay attention to China as both as a market, as a manufacturer, and as a competitor. Those were 20th century things. And you still worry about them in the 21st. But here are 2 things which are both innovation killers that actually tripped up both GE and Procter & Gamble. One is the rules have changed completely about public and activist investors. Activist investors is now the polite 21st century name for corporate raiders. But the rules have changed, at least in the United States. It used to be you used to need to own a majority of the stock of the company or a substantive majority of the stock to affect management change. Now these corporate raiders who took over P&G and General Electric only owned 1.5% of the stock. So how did they just change the entire strategic direction of these companies that employed hundreds of thousands of people? It turns out that in the United States, institutional investors, that is hedge funds, pension funds, university endowments, et cetera, own the majority of the stock of large US corporations. They used to be long-term holders of stock. They're no longer interested in long-term holders. They're interested in immediate gratification now, and these activist investors have played to their interest to say, GE, which was one of the worst performing stocks in 2017, if we take on a ton of debt and buy back our stock, boy, and we dump all these parts of our business that are non-performing, we could pump up the stock price and we'll all be happy. Well, that's great for the stock price, but certainly kills any potential for innovation. And so you need to think about that now if you're a 21st century CEO. The other thing that's new, which kind of snuck up on us, is we talk about disruption, but we haven't talked about explicitly what that means to a CEO. In startups in the 20th century, I used to describe as ankle biters. That is, people who could maybe get up to your ankles if you were a corporation. They certainly were annoying, but never a competitor. And the reason why is they never had the cash and scale to do that. If you haven't noticed, startups today are now raising hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars. They now have more capital than the incumbents. It's a big idea. And the other big idea is startups are now focused on breaking the law to disrupt your industry. If you haven't figured that out, look at Airbnb, look at Uber, look at Tesla. They're actually been designed to, if we could break the law, can we reshape this entire industry? Investors never even considered that as a strategy in the 20th century. So these are the new four forces that, while CEOs are thinking about continuous innovation, and with all due credit to Jeff Immelt and the CTO and CEO of Procter & Gamble, who had their eye on long-term innovation strategies for their company, there are short-term pressures on innovation that are sometimes unpredictable and actually could stifle innovation. And so one of the things I'd like you to think about is, how do you shape your organization for innovation to match these forces? Let me remind you what they are. What are your board expectations? What are competitive pressures? Do you have to deal in your country with public and activist investors? And what are the disruptive pressures? How are you actually shaping your organization? Do you have an innovation program? Do you focus entirely on execution? And how does innovation match those forces? Alexander?
Great. So 1 minute buzz group with your seat neighbor again to discuss this question up here. Let's go. You still had 40 seconds. You still had 40 seconds. Can you hand this over to Bill, please? Good? Okay. Okay. Let's continue together. Shh. Okay. Excellent. Even an international audience can follow Swiss rules. Okay, so I have the pleasure to hand over the floor to Bill Fischer, Professor of Innovation Management at IMD, has been following the evolution of how Hire has dealt with innovation from the inside, from the outside over the last 20 years. Mm-hmm. And you are now also a fellow Swiss, as I understood. You had to go through examinations.
My coming out.
Great. Bill.
Okay, good afternoon. It's always a pleasure to be at the Drucker Forum. I think for me it's the most interesting, engaging meeting of the year. So I'm delighted to be here. I want to talk about how one organization, one rather large organization, not anywhere near a startup, is striving to try to cross the chasm, but doing it the other way. And what I mean by this is to look at a manufacturing firm. We've heard a lot about how automation is removing the potency and influence of automation. But just last week, a study came out from McKinsey about making it in America. And the conclusion was, there were several conclusions that were interesting. One is that inclusive growth, when you think about manufacturing, is a tale of two sectors. One is the sector we hear most frequently, the high-tech sector, the cutting edge, all of the things that are so exciting. The other sector is the one that Irene Yuan-Sun spoke about earlier today when she spoke about box making and flip-flops and a lot of commodity products that still matter in our lives and in our economy. And that's the one I want to talk about because, in fact, maybe it's premature to write them off. Maybe we can't afford to write them off. But if we want inclusive growth, somehow we have to consider what this means for them. So one of the things that I was struck by was if you think about the numbers in terms of employment and percentage of GDP, exports, even in the United States, manufacturing still plays a non-insignificant role. It's not what it used to be, but it's not irrelevant either. And in fact, that's after 2 lost decades. The next challenge is robotics, analytics, the Internet of Things, 3D printing. Who knows what comes next? And the question is, are these firms able to stand up to this challenge and survive? The McKinsey report suggests that one of the remedies that needs to be considered is to consider new ways to create value, looking for new business models and a new way of dealing with the manufacturing workforce of the future. So I was recently given the opportunity to speak with one organization that's trying to do this. We're all familiar with Crossing the Chasm, Jeffrey Moore's work, which in fact introduced a lot of us to the way in which we needed to think about experimentation, iterations, prototyping, all of the sorts of unconventional ways of approaching not only innovation, but also the way we structured work in organizations. The organization that I'm thinking of, which is GE Appliances, just recently bought by the Haier Group, is trying to cross the chasm in reverse. So they're trying to undo 112 years of mature manufacturing practices. They have 12,000 employees. They're very far from a startup. They produce a commodity product in a mature market. They have 12% of the US domestic market in home appliances. And they feel that if they're going to sustain their business, they need to go the other way. They need to reinvent themselves, their products, and how they work. Because the challenges of the Internet of Things, the Internet of the kitchen, are going to change the entire battlefield that they're competing on, and they need to rethink themselves along the way. And so what they've begun to do is to launch a number of initiatives that I think are quite interesting. I think they're interesting because I think they speak to Julia Kirby's guiding principles. You know, the augmentation of both human and machine capabilities by the merging of both of them. And I think they speak to Martin Reeves' 8 imperatives. Strangely enough, when Martin went through that list today, I was sort of checking them off. And I think that what GE Appliances is doing pretty much matches that set. They are reinventing, revitalizing the core. So they have chosen not to partition groups that are working on the present from groups that are working on the future. They say we're going to try to move everybody into the future at one time. You remember last year, Gary Hamel was espousing that same thing. You were not, I think, but that's a different story, right? They were talking about re-engineering a vibrant community, trying to give everybody a place in that community. A community of business owners, not just a small tribe of startup enthusiasts, but a real sense of everybody being involved in this. That means shifting the mindset, shifting to a maker mindset. That means giving people end-to-end responsibility and involvement, what's going on. And their conclusion, like so many of the panelists that we've heard today talking about the virtues of the network manager and hyperconnectivity, is to really become hyperconnected. Extreme, radically open approach to getting ideas, inviting people in very early in the process, sharing the ownership and the oversight of what comes next. Choosing to favor connections over products. connections in the products because it's going into a new commercial environment, the internet of the kitchen, but also connections in the organization. So they can draw better ideas from a wider community of people than they have within their own 12,000. Playing to win, okay? I noticed that there's one of the books that's featured is Playing to Win. One of the things that I was struck by was so many of the managers said that under the old leadership, they were playing not to lose. And in fact, playing to win is energizing. It feels like they're responsible and they have a stake in the future. And in fact, the concluding comment they had is, with these initiatives, we've been given back our future. We've been given back a chance to matter, rather than being an appendage, maybe an unwanted appendage, in a much larger, complex organization. So you think about the themes we've talked about today: dignity of work, reshaping work, taking chances, being experimental. All of these things are going on in this mature organization. They've only been at it for 4 months now. It's much too early to tell what will happen. They have a portfolio of initiatives. They have 5 or 6 or 7 of these initiatives, very different, going in parallel. But what they want to do is they want to breathe life back into an organization that may very well have been written off as part of the past. And I think that when I look at where manufacturing plays out in the American geography, one of the things I think is that the places where manufacturing is under most duress is places where people have lost hope, feel like they've been left behind. So there's a very important political potential here as well. It's not just about making money, it's about revitalizing communities. Good. Thank you. Okay, thank you.
Question? Can we put up the question?
Oh, the buzz. Oh, of course, I forgot.
So funny enough, I learned about the buzz groups from Bill.
So the irony is that buzz groups are part of the IMD tradition, and we took them from General Electric. So it's nice to pay back the compliment. What I'd be interested in is, if we're reawakening old skills when we cross the chasm in reverse, what leadership skills do you feel are most in need of revitalization in mature, old economy incumbent market leaders? What do leaders need to do that they used to do, but they need to do it better now? And unlike the Silicon Valley option, we're talking about real people making real things. And so, you know, we both grew up in New York at the same time. I think we understand. So what do you think? What is the revitalization of leadership involved?
Okay, let's go. 1 minute discussion with your seat neighbor. Okay.
That was great. My other observation is, corporate incubators, accelerators, et cetera, we now have enough data. What we're now working on is connecting them politely. 300,
Okay. Okay, let's continue together.
That's speed of velocity.
Okay, so I'd like to hand over for a last panel presentation before we move to the conversation. Ashok Krish will talk to us a little bit. He's head of social media and workplace reimagination practice at TCS Digital Enterprise at Tata Consultancy Services. So he will zoom in a bit and take the human perspective, maybe from the bottom up.
So after these fascinating sessions, I'm particularly interested in how digital technology particularly can solve a lot of basic low-hanging fruit from the point of view of enabling innovation inside large organizations. Because the interesting thing is that not enough attention is paid to how companies actively prevent innovation. And there's some really simple things that modern-day digital technology can do. And it's also important to realize that the technology is not the innovation, but the ability to set people free, give them those enablers, will then help them get to the next step of actually changing the culture of innovation within organizations. And I'll give some examples of how TCS has tried this over the years and so on. Right? So the very first thing is the fact that in many organizations, you don't realize that information today wants to be free. not necessarily. So it's essentially the culture of working out loud actively helps innovation in many situations. Not just only the use of traditional messaging technologies like email and so on, but the right mix of conversational tools and also social networks and the embracing of open source cultures within organizations often make a difference, because what it does is that it enables serendipitous discovery of connections. It enables serendipitous discovery of information and other people, right? So it helps you sort of tap into the cognitive surplus of the organization. The second thing is that once you do that, you kind of get to the next step, which is that departments and functions within organizations in a truly innovative organization need to be ambiently aware, not super specialized, right? So what used to be called attention deficit is now called continuous partial attention. And that the most interdisciplinary, multi-skilled people are by design really need to look at multiple things, right? So what's interesting is that in many roles, not all, I still want my brain surgeon to be a specialist, but I do not want my digital architect, I don't want some of my business process leads to actually be narrow specialists, because a lot of innovation now happens on the edges and at the intersection of multiple areas, right? So we've seen this. A lot of disruption happens from the outside, right? So in the tech world, the Silicon Valley calls them full stack ninjas, essentially someone who can do everything from design an app to build an app and host it on the cloud. In other words, a 10-year-old kid in the US, right? So, and this culture of what we call agile DevOps is something that you've almost always heard your IT guys use. Here's the interesting thing, right? Digital as a foundation is a default, right? Technology is not IT's department. If you want to be innovative, technology is something that you will have to embrace, and it's really, really simple, and then you can start innovating on top of that, right? So the ability to really create those open playgrounds for innovation and make that simple is really, really important, right? So the third interesting thing is how you literally motivate and actually incentivize innovation and a culture of collaboration within your organization. And what we've seen a lot of good companies do from the point of view of this is to really think in terms of what's called the quantified self, right? So if your iPhone can tell you how many steps you climbed, how many miles you ran, and how many calories you burnt, and you kind of set yourself goals, there are now interesting ways in which you can nudge and gently use these interesting creative measures by which you can persuade people to connect together and so on. And one interesting sort of story I want to tell you is how in the last 2 years we managed to get 250,000 people trained in some of the most complex new digital skills at TCS simply by making it a do-it-yourself, learn-it-yourself, and making it very clear that digital is default. You pick up all these skills, and then you feel free to innovate. We'll give you the cloud environments, we'll give you all of the knowledge, we'll give you the tools, and now turn your ideas into actual execution instead of waiting for approval from IT and so on, right? So, which essentially means that your processes internally have to be designed persuasively, right? So it's not about metrics, it's about the quantified self. It's not just procedures, it's also gamification. And it's not change management. It's about small nudges that make it easy for people to actually innovate. The last point here is really about collective wisdom, right? In most large organizations, you're not tapping into the cognitive surplus of your entire organization, especially in an era where people are multi-skilled and interdisciplinary. Most organizational structures are still, you are in this department, this is what you do, I do not need your input for something like this, right? So when you really think about those kinds of teams, you have to kind of break these barriers as well. So again, the use of collaborative social technologies within the enterprise has an interesting starting point, but really speaking, you've got to be able to think in terms of what do I do as projects and what do I do as hackathons? What do I simply do outsource, or what do I do in the form of a co-innovation network that involves academia and startups and yourself and in a larger ecosystem? And what do I do in committees, and what do I do with smart mobs, right? So the whole idea is that innovation really works well in smart mobs, not necessarily in committees, right? So in some sense, the structure of your organizations also needs to undergo a change. It's really not just about teams and hierarchies, it's also about clans and tribes, right? So clans are essentially people with multiple skills from multiple departments but who have the technological capability and the empowerment to get together and the ability to turn ideas into prototypes and experiment it, put it out on the cloud, build a mobile app, try some AI, try some automation, regardless of what your industry is, and get that done. And tribes are really about communities of practice, which is people with the same skills across a globally distributed organization. In fact, even including, in many cases, your competition as well. So how do you actually design people networks for maximizing cognitive surplus is something that all of you need to think about when you want to sort of encourage innovation. And this is essentially my last slide, which is that I really think a lot of innovation in large organizations needs to, first of all, come from a culture of playing, which is a culture of continuous experimentation. And play also is important because, well, you know, somebody has to provide the ball and the playground too. And that's really where the organization comes in, right? So it's not just enough to put people together and say, now start innovating, but it helps if you give them cloud environments without making them go through complex finance approvals. It helps to give them certain simple design tools. It helps sort of creating a culture where a lot of decisions are made through hackathons and smart mobs and so on. The second thing, IT is not the sole responsibility, IT does not have the sole responsibility for technology. In this new world, everybody should be a technologist. So therefore, this idea that everybody needs to understand code at some level is really, really critical in order for you to be innovative. And third, the culture of hackathons, build continuously, experiment, and fail fast, and the ability to repeat this pretty much regularly, right? So that's what I have to say. Thank you. And my question...
Go ahead.
And my question is, in the light of the fact that you really need to think in terms of interdisciplinary teams. You really need to put people who would generally not tolerate each other in the same room together to really force innovation in many areas. What challenges will your organization face when you attempt to create these multidisciplinary teams that cut across departmental functions?
Okay, let's go 1 minute buzz group with your seat neighbor and have a short conversation after that. Okay. Okay. Shh. Okay. So we have about 15 minutes to have a conversation with the panelists. I would suggest you keep your comments short. I'd like to kick it off just with one question. So we were talking about unleashing innovation and entrepreneurial potential in organizations. But we could also argue that it doesn't matter if some organizations go away and that capital is reallocated into startups or other organizations that happen to be more innovative. So why should we care about unleashing entrepreneurial potential?
So if we don't care about jobs or employment or people, I guess we shouldn't. And that's, you know, there are some parts of the United States where uber capitalism is actually the dominant theme. And in fact, that is the notion of activist investors, is their only goal is to optimize stock price. And if it includes laying off people or cutting factories, then that is the notion of capitalism. Here in Europe, that's not the primary goal, but there are different views on how that occurs. So there are downsides to doing that.
Yeah, if I may, I think we should care because there is typically a delta between what these new startups and entrepreneurial organizations do and what kinds of skills the people who work for them require, and the skills that the people who get displaced have. And when you think about the amount of capital that large organizations have, they can actually preempt some of these kinds of disruptions and really decimation of communities if they think about what's coming next, if they think about investing in their people so that they essentially preempt this kind of disruption. So it's not necessarily only about keeping large organizations large or relevant, but we're actually talking about our community structure, our community fabrics. And when we think about the rise in populism and dissatisfaction and income inequality, perhaps we may not feel the impact of those things today, in a severe way, but we definitely will. So we have to think about how large organizations can innovate. It's absolutely necessary, in my opinion.
Any other reactions?
And Alexander, if I can, just one more. I just want to riff off of that comment. In the United States, we've just seen the effect of what happens when clusters collapse because of, as you mentioned, the skill sets of the people who are unemployed don't match not only the new jobs, they can't afford to travel and buy houses in the communities that actually have those new jobs. That might be a typical American phenomenon, but it in fact is what created the politics of hopelessness in a good chunk of the United States. The cluster collapsed, there are new jobs they're unskilled for, and even if they went to Silicon Valley or New York, they couldn't afford to live there.
Yeah, I would agree completely. I think ideas move very easily, people less so. So one of the, but the other thing I think that's important about this is that in many cases, the employees who are being disrupted, because it's the employees being disrupted, not just the devices, the employees being disrupted are actually better than the organizations that they've been a part of have allowed them to be. So my sense is that if we can take innovation and not think about it as a noun, in other words, not think about it as some group or some product or some device, but think about it as a verb, something that characterizes the way we work, literally changing the way we work, then I think we have an opportunity to restore some freedom to the way in which people display or deploy their talent. And I think it gives them a chance to fulfill some of the promise that was already seen when they were in school and when they were being hired. So my sense is that it's a revitalization of a community, not only because we can keep jobs there, but because we can make the jobs more interesting.
Very short, I think Bill mostly said what I wanted to say, but see, the large companies, large corporations for the last 200 years have been a fundamental part of the fabric of our society. And they're an integral part of, you go to school, you go to university, you have a career in maybe one or two large companies, and you retire. And it's the fact that at this point, it's not as if we have a clear understanding of what the world will look like if everyone worked in a startup. And startups will not be able to employ everyone either. They employ a very specific kind of people. So I think it's really crucial to have large organizations change with the times so that they can adapt to the newer world while simply not dying out, because I think over the next decade or so, we will really need both. We will need startups, we will need large companies. So I don't think it can just disappear one way or another.
So, yeah, sure.
Just one quick comment. About a month ago, Clay and I had breakfast with Steve Case, so founder of AOL, and he's doing a lot of things with different cities in the US. And he said about 90% or so of venture capital goes to 3 cities in America: San Francisco, Boston, New York. And so when we talk about repurposing capital and going to startups, it essentially means all this capital is going to 3 cities, and we can't move the whole US to San Francisco, New York, or Boston. And so it does really, really matter.
Yeah. So one of the questions I have to the panelists is, very few organizations were so far able to unleash this innovation and entrepreneurial potential and systematically produce growth engines. And Steve, you mentioned some of the reasons why, but there are outliers there. Typically, Amazon is one that systematically creates new growth engines. So what distinguishes these outliers? Is it, the type of leadership that is just not existing enough in other organizations, and it's maybe a new generation of leaders that will bring this? But it's troubling me that some can do it, but there are very few. What is it in the leadership that they're doing right that so many others just can't do, in the constraints that we've seen?
So historically, if you think about every large company, way back in the past, it was a startup. Big idea, right? And if you ever think about those large companies, they're almost never still run, with the exception of technology companies you mentioned, run by their founders. In fact, they're run by executors of plans, processes, procedures, and KPIs. That is, they're run by Horizon 1 managers. And Horizon 1 managers are world-class executors and happen to have difficulty in dealing with ambiguity and chaos, which is the kind of conundrum about dealing with continuous disruption now. the companies you mentioned, they're actually still run by their founders who are continually disrupting their own business. And that is the problem when I deal with large government organizations or companies. In fact, innovation is such a buzzword. When you ask them, well, what does it mean? They go, you know, have you seen our new incubator? And you kind of go, no, why are we doing innovation? And can I give you a quick example? So imagine a national security organization in any one of your countries here. You know, every year they get guidance and mission from the government that says you're supposed to execute these kinds of things to keep your nation safe and secure. It turns out, even if they perfectly execute, their agency's capabilities are degrading yearly. Why? Because technology times out, tradecraft times out, et cetera. They're actually getting worse. So a number one reason that you could explain to them is innovation, at minimum, is to keep your capabilities at least current. But that's not the only reason the organization needs to exist. It needs to actually get ahead of new threats. So it needs to actually use innovation to create new capabilities no one else even thought about. And all of a sudden, you've just given leadership, oh, I get it, innovation does those two things. And then you explain, yes, and you need an organization and people and whatever to kind of run an innovation pipeline, because the last thing I'll say is we've run a series of experiments over the last couple of years that we've run innovation activities. People have corporate incubators, people have whatever. They've ended up actually as innovation theater. You get great coffee cups and posters, but almost nothing out the other end. We've now understood we need to run an innovation pipeline with rigor and metrics the same as we run execution pipelines, and we now know how to do that, but it's hard. It requires, again, leadership that gets us back to the 20th century term of ambidextrous organizations.
So that's an interesting observation. If we take Hire, it's also run by an entrepreneur, right, who started the organization. Are there some similarities there?
I think it's exactly, I think there's two qualifications or characteristics I would add to the founder argument. One is that usually they've started the business because they themselves have been frustrated by a customer experience, an existing customer experience. So they're completely obsessed by the customer experience, and that leads to willingness to make big changes. The other thing is they have power. They have a lot of power. They can act fast. They have an end-to-end familiarity with the business, and they, in a sense, encapsulate so many of the things we associate with, you know, great innovation.
So, yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry, if I may. So last night I had a conversation with the brilliant Professor Gupta. So if you haven't had a conversation with him before you leave, you need to talk to him. I just outed him right now. He essentially said the average CEO tenure is 4 years, right? There's almost nothing you can do about it. That's what it is. So if you're a CEO, you've got 4 years, you've got competitive pressures, you've got investor pressures, you've got to report efficiency metrics every 3 months. The last thing on your mind is long-term innovation. It's incredibly difficult. So that's number one. We have to just appreciate it for what it is. It's incredibly difficult. Not impossible, but difficult. The second thing is, as you're thinking about this kind of long-term innovation, you have to manage the core business. You have to report these earnings. You have to make sure the company is strong. There's a book called Dual Transformation. Scott Anthony wrote it, and he talks essentially about how do you manage these two things, because it's almost like using the right and left side of your brain, where you have to be very efficient in reporting metrics, but you also have to be thinking about the longevity of your organization. And so I think that's something that we should all be thinking about.
So maybe one angle, we could also look at it from the other side. I'll give you an opportunity to take, I'm curious about your position on this. We talked about the organization, the leadership, but we could also say that, well, nowadays maybe it's the team members, the staff, the employees who could vote with their feet. That if an organization does not innovate, well, you probably don't want to work there. And, you know, people are getting smarter and smarter, and we can start to understand which companies are innovating. So are we seeing that happening? And you were talking about this, you know, connectivity and information is everywhere, needs to be free. Are people voting with their feet?
Absolutely. This is actually starting to happen. I mean, let's take a very simple example. Even within the technology industry, when we serve something like a bank, 10 years ago, the person in a back office was essentially doing a very simple manual transaction, the kind of which now is entirely automated. You know, check clearances, all those kinds of things, right? So the kind of knowledge work that people even at the lowest end do now is significantly cognitively more complex, with greater empowerment in making decisions, with greater access to data, and a world of knowledge where you can essentially see what are the interesting opportunities out there, right? So what's interesting is that young people tend to see institutions getting created within organizations, right? So what happens is, over time, processes ossify, and then they become institutions, right? So these are barriers to innovation, right? And as Clayton said, institutions are experts in sustaining problems to which they are the solution, right? And this is something that just keeps sort of multiplies, and over time, everything, and you kind of see in large organizations, it's hard to get things done in a different way because of that. And essentially, what a lot of millennials and young people tend to do is they don't come from a world where they've had to take permission for anything, right? Everything is available at the drop of a hat, and so they naturally start gravitating towards organizations where that's a little bit more flexible.
Bill, you teach innovation and you have all these bright students. Are they seeing innovation as a career path? Because we could argue that today in most companies, going into innovation is career suicide. Right. So teaching these students, what's their career choice after going through this interesting topic? But when it comes to career, there are few organizations that really value innovation, growth innovation, market-creating innovation, the way we'd like to see it.
So IMD is a very strange place because we have so much more in executive engagement. Within our MBA program, there seems to be a definite movement towards going out and starting a business or joining a startup or being an entrepreneur. And I certainly see that also in my own family. But if we look at the bulk of the people who are passing through IMD, they're mid-40s to mid-50s. They're in established, incumbent, successful market leaders. They also feel this pull, but it's harder to act on because they have so many family obligations and the like. And that's not an excuse, but at the same time, the companies that employ them are getting far less of the talent that they're paying for than they could. So it's a two-way street, right? And I think if we could open up avenues for greater entrepreneurial involvement, people would rush to it within established firms.
Right. So Steve, because the avenue, I think if we can take the same question, what's interesting with you is you're teaching at Stanford, where probably people would go more into entrepreneurship, and you're teaching at Berkeley, which is more maybe the corporate track. So do you see any differences in the way people make their career choices?
Well, slightly different. Berkeley tends to also focus on more social things than Stanford engineers, who are figuring out whether they're going to take this term sheet or this other term sheet. But one of the things is important to define is what's an entrepreneur and what's innovation. And if we use the McKinsey model of Horizon 1, 2, and 3, Silicon Valley is Horizon 3. And I want you all to consider that founders, not employees, but founders are closer to artists than any other profession. They see things that others don't. They hear things that others don't. And they're willing to go to a goal regardless of the obstacles in their way. Founding a company or doing a Horizon 3 project inside of a large corporation is not a job, it's a calling. Just like an artist, you're called, and you will do anything to actually accomplish that. That differentiates true entrepreneurs from people who are innovative or want to work on innovative projects. And having that hierarchy and understanding the distinction between Horizon 1, 2, and 3 inside a corporation, where Horizon 1 and 2 belongs in existing P&Ls and divisions and is part of continuous innovation, where Horizon 3 needs to be physically separate. And you need a pipeline and a portfolio of all three as a mix, which I think your work, Alexander, has kind of been critical in having people figure out how to manage portfolios of innovation.
Could I just jump in? One of the things that we see routinely is many of the managers we work with are so much more interesting outside of work than they are inside of work. They've got projects, they've got things that they're fooling around with, they're full of ideas. When they walk into work the next day, all of those things are moderated by power structures and turf and hierarchy and a bunch of things that rob them of their. Do you want to make one more comment? Okay,
So I was at a conference yesterday or a couple of days ago, and there was a slide, just to support Bill's point, there was a slide that someone showed where which is so funny, where all the great ideas come from. And so these managers, when they're out in nature, going on strolls, taking a swim, that's when they get all these great ideas. And the least amount of ideas come from when they're in the office, in meetings. And so I would suggest maybe just reorganizing your workplace. That might help.
So in the interest of Swiss timekeeping, we're actually exactly on time, and I think we should thank the panel for this excellent conversation.